The rain fell in thick, icy sheets, pounding relentlessly against the cobblestone driveway of Veronica Gray's sprawling mansion. She stepped out of the sleek black car, tugging the collar of her coat tighter around her neck, her heels clicking as she made her way toward the front door. Her mind buzzed with the remnants of a high-stakes meeting earlier in the day, and all she craved was the quiet solitude of her home. As she approached the towering iron gates, something caught her eye. A small, motionless figure huddled just beyond the bars. It was impossible to make out at first, but as she stepped closer, the silhouette became clearer. A child, soaking wet, knees pulled up to their chest, shivering violently under the relentless downpour. Veronica's heart skipped a beat. She glanced around the empty street, hoping to see someone, a parent, a passerby, anyone who could explain why this child was sitting outside her home in the pouring rain. But there was no one. The streetlights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows that seemed to swallow the little figure whole. "Hello," Veronica called out, her voice uncharacteristically soft. She wasn't used to talking to children, nor was she comfortable with the vulnerability suddenly thrust upon her. The child didn't respond, only curled tighter into themselves as if shrinking from the cold and from her. Without thinking, she opened the gate and approached the figure. Up close, she could see that the child was small, no more than 6 or 7 years old, drenched from head to toe. A shock of dirty blonde hair clung to their forehead, and their tiny frame was almost skeletal beneath the soaked clothing. "What's your name?" Veronica asked, kneeling down. The child looked up, their wide, frightened eyes meeting hers for the first time. In the child's hand was a crumpled piece of paper. Trembling, they held it out toward her. Veronica hesitated, then took the note. The paper was damp and smudged, but the writing was clear. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the words. "Veronica, this is Eli. He is your nephew. I had no choice." Veronica stared at the note, feeling the world tilt beneath her feet. Nephew. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what little she knew about her estranged brother and their mother, both of whom she hadn't spoken to in years. She folded the note carefully, her hands shaking slightly. She looked back at the child, Eli, who stared at her with the same wide, frightened eyes. "Come inside," she said softly, standing up. "Let's get you warm." Inside the mansion, the contrast was jarring. The warmth of the luxurious interior, the soft hum of the central heating, and the muted glow of the designer lighting all seemed like a world apart from the storm raging outside. Veronica led Eli into the foyer, unsure of what to do next. Her life had been neatly compartmentalized: business, wealth, control. And now, standing in front of her, was a reminder of everything she had left behind. "Sit," she said, motioning to the plush couch in the living room. Eli obeyed, perching on the edge, as if unsure whether he was allowed to be there. His wet clothes dripped onto the hardwood floor, but Veronica barely noticed. Her mind was still processing the note. "Veronica, this is Eli. He is your nephew. I had no choice." She read the note again, trying to decipher the hurried scrawl. It was from her mother. That much was clear. But why now? Why leave this child, her brother's son, on her doorstep like some kind of last resort? She needed answers. But first, she had to make sure Eli was all right. Veronica grabbed a towel from a nearby closet and handed it to him. "Dry yourself off," she instructed, keeping her voice steady, though inside, her thoughts were spiraling. As Eli began to dry his hair, Veronica sat down across from him, staring at the small figure that seemed so out of place in her pristine home. He looked fragile, like a bird that had been caught in a storm, unable to fly anymore. "Where's your father?" she asked, her voice gentler than she expected. Eli paused, lowering the towel, his eyes filled with confusion and fear. "He's gone," Eli whispered, barely audible. "He left." Veronica felt a pang of something deep inside her, a flicker of anger, of guilt, of helplessness. Her brother. She hadn't seen or spoken to him in years, and now his child was sitting in her living room, cold and abandoned. "How long were you out there?" she asked, trying to maintain control of the situation, but the vulnerability in Eli's eyes was making it harder. I don't know, Eli mumbled, wrapping the towel tighter around himself. His small hands shook, whether from the cold or fear. She couldn't tell. Veronica's mind raced. She had no experience with children, none at all. Her life was filled with board meetings, investments, and strategies, not caring for abandoned nephews. But there was no turning back now. The note had said her mother had no choice, and if her mother couldn't take care of Eli, then she sighed, standing up. "You'll stay here tonight," she said, more to herself than to Eli. "We'll figure this out in the morning." As she made her way to the guest bedroom to set up a place for Eli, Veronica couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The past she had so carefully pushed away was creeping back, threatening to dismantle everything she had built. The following morning, Veronica sat at the kitchen table, her eyes fixed on the cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. The rain had subsided overnight, leaving the city shrouded in mist. She had hardly slept, her mind racing with questions she wasn't ready to face. Eli sat quietly across from her, staring down at the plate of scrambled eggs she had hastily prepared. He had eaten very little, only picking at the food like someone too nervous to fully relax. Veronica couldn't blame him. He was in a stranger's home, and she, a stranger, was now responsible for him. She didn't know what to do. Her first instinct had been to call social services, but the thought of handing Eli over to the system made something inside her recoil. He was her nephew, her brother's son, and as much as she had distanced herself from her family, the thought of abandoning him felt wrong. The phone on the counter buzzed, and Veronica glanced at it. An unread email from her assistant, reminding her of a critical meeting scheduled for later that day. A sharp pang of anxiety coursed through her. Her work had always been her sanctuary, the one thing she could control. Now, with Eli here, everything felt out of balance. "Do you have school today?" Veronica asked, breaking the silence. Eli shook his head, his small hands gripping the edge of the table. "I don't go to school anymore." Veronica blinked, taken aback by the bluntness of his response. "Why not?" Eli shrugged, his eyes darting away from hers. "We move a lot. My dad said it was better to stay home." The words hung in the air, and Veronica felt a deepening sense of unease. Where was her brother? And why had he dragged his poor child through so much instability? She picked up the phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years, her mother's. The line rang once, twice, and then went to voicemail. Of course, she had half expected this. The estrangement wasn't new. It had been festering for years, ever since she chose to prioritize her own success over the chaotic life her family had descended into. Veronica set the phone down, her frustration mounting. She couldn't just sit here and wait for answers that might never come. But she also couldn't ignore the growing responsibility that was now staring her in the face, still too small and fragile to articulate his needs. "I need to go out for a bit," she said finally, standing up. "You'll stay here. The housekeeper will be here soon, and she'll look after you." Eli's eyes widened. "Where are you going?" Veronica hesitated. "I need to sort some things out. I'll be back soon." She wasn't sure if that was true, but she couldn't let this uncertainty derail everything she had built. She needed a plan. As she walked toward the door, Eli's voice stopped her in her tracks. "Are you going to leave me too?" The question hit her like a blow. She turned back, seeing the fear in his eyes. The same fear she had felt when she left home all those years ago, convinced that the only way to survive was to cut ties completely. "No," she said, her voice softer than before. "I'm not leaving you." The drive to the private investigator's office felt longer than usual. Veronica's mind was a whirlwind of emotions she had worked hard to suppress for years. As she sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel, she couldn't help but think back to the last time she had seen her brother. It had been more than 10 years ago, at their mother's house, where arguments and chaos had reigned. Her brother, Jason, had always been reckless, chasing one failed venture after another, while she had fought to escape the cycle of instability that seemed to define their family. Leaving them behind had felt like the only way to survive. Now, Jason's son was living proof that escape wasn't as easy as she had thought. Veronica arrived at the investigator's office and stepped inside, greeted by the faint smell of coffee and old paper. She had hired James Rowland before, during a complicated merger that required digging into some questionable backgrounds, and he had always been thorough. "Veronica," James greeted her with a nod as she entered his office. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon after the last case. This isn't business," she replied, sitting down. "I need you to find someone. My brother." James raised an eyebrow but didn't ask any questions. He leaned back in his chair, reaching for a notepad. "What's the situation?" She told him everything about the note, Eli's arrival, and the years of silence from her brother. As she spoke, a deep-seated guilt began to gnaw at her. She had walked away, leaving her family to fend for themselves, but now the choice was coming back to haunt her in ways she couldn't have predicted. James listened carefully, scribbling down notes. When she finished, he looked up, his expression serious. Finding someone who doesn't want to be found isn't easy, especially if they're deliberately staying off the grid. "Do you have any idea where he might have gone?" Veronica shook her head. "I cut ties years ago. The last I heard, he was moving from place to place, but I have no idea why he disappeared like this." James nodded. "I'll see what I can do. It might take some time, but I'll find him." "Thank you," Veronica said, standing up. As she turned to leave, a thought struck her. "And James, I need this to stay quiet. I don't want anyone else knowing about this." He nodded, understanding. Veronica couldn't afford any distractions in her professional life, especially not something as personal as this. She had worked too hard to let her past seep into the carefully crafted image she had built. As she left the office, Veronica felt a strange mix of emotions: relief that she was finally taking steps to find her brother, but also a deep sense of dread. She had walked away from her family once, but now there was no escaping the consequences. When she arrived back home, the house was eerily quiet. The housekeeper had come and gone, and Eli was sitting in the living room, drawing with some paper and crayons the housekeeper had found. His face brightened when he saw her, and Veronica felt an unexpected warmth in her chest. She had never wanted this, never imagined herself taking care of a child, let alone her brother's. But as she stood in the doorway, watching Eli concentrate on his drawing, something inside her softened. Maybe she hadn't escaped her family after all. Days passed in a blur of responsibilities that Veronica was ill-prepared to handle. Every morning, she would rise early, check her phone for any updates from James, and then return to the pressing reality of taking care of Eli. The transition from her once orderly, predictable life to this new existence felt jarring, as though she were inhabiting a life that wasn't her own. Eli remained quiet, keeping mostly to himself. He would sit on the plush sofa with a blanket wrapped tightly around him, staring out of the window as though waiting for someone to arrive. Veronica wondered what he was thinking, what memories were playing through his young mind, but she couldn't bring herself to ask. Her experience with children, especially one so fragile and vulnerable, was next to nothing. In between her attempts to maintain her professional obligations and care for Eli, she thought about her brother. Jason had always been a drifter, never able to hold down a job, never able to stick to anything. She couldn't count the number of times she had bailed him out of trouble, only for him to fall back into the same destructive patterns. Still, as much as he frustrated her, she couldn't understand how he had abandoned his own child. The silence in the house gnawed at her. She needed answers. She needed to know what had happened to Jason and why Eli had been left behind. But the trail was cold. James had yet to provide any solid leads, and her mother was still unreachable. Veronica had to admit that, for the first time in a long time, she felt powerless. One evening, as Veronica was reviewing documents for an upcoming business meeting, the phone rang. She picked it up immediately, hoping it was James with some new information. "Veronica," James' voice came through the line. "I've found something." Veronica's heart raced. She stood up, pacing across the room. "What is it? Where is he?" James hesitated, his tone cautious. "I haven't found Jason yet, but I've been digging into his recent movements. It seems he's been in and out of various locations, homeless shelters, cheap motels. He's been running from something or someone." Veronica stopped pacing, her mind reeling. Running from what? There are rumors that Jason got mixed up with some dangerous people. Debt collectors. Maybe more. He owes money. Lots of it. And he's been laying low to avoid them. Veronica felt a cold shiver run down her spine. This was worse than she had imagined. Jason wasn't just missing. He was in real danger. And now, with Eli under her care, she had to face the possibility that those same people could come looking for them. "I'll keep digging," James said, breaking the silence. "But I wanted to warn you, this situation might be more complicated than we thought." Veronica swallowed hard. "Thanks, James. Keep me updated." She hung up the phone and stared at the walls of her home, the luxurious furnishings suddenly feeling oppressive. She had worked so hard to distance herself from her past, but no matter how far she ran, it seemed her family's troubles were always one step behind her. She glanced over at Eli, who was now fast asleep on the couch, his tiny body curled up beneath the blanket. He looked so small, so innocent. It wasn't fair for him to be caught in the middle of all this. Veronica sighed and walked over to him, gently pulling the blanket up to cover him better. As she stood there, watching him sleep, she knew that she couldn't wait for the answers to come to her. She had to take action, for Eli's sake and for her own. The next morning, Veronica woke up with a newfound sense of determination. If her brother's disappearance was tied to dangerous people, she needed to protect Eli at all costs. She couldn't just sit around, waiting for James to uncover more. There was no telling what might happen in the meantime. After getting Eli settled with breakfast, she made a few calls, canceling her meetings for the day. Her colleagues were surprised. Veronica Gray never canceled meetings, especially not without a good reason. But she didn't care. She needed to focus on the more pressing issue at hand, keeping Eli safe and finding her brother before it was too late. As the day wore on, Eli began to open up to her in small ways. He asked her questions about the house, about her work, about why she lived alone. Veronica was taken aback by his curiosity. For a child who had been through so much, Eli seemed remarkably resilient, even if he carried a sadness that was hard to ignore. In the afternoon, she decided to take him for a walk in the nearby park. The fresh air would do them both some good, and she hoped it might help ease the tension she felt building inside her. As they walked along the tree-lined paths, Eli's small hand gripping hers tightly, Veronica found herself thinking about how strange it felt to be caring for him. "Do you miss him?" Eli's voice broke the silence. Veronica glanced down at him. "Who?" "My dad," Eli said softly. "Do you miss him?" Veronica wasn't sure how to answer. The truth was complicated. She had missed Jason when they were younger, back when they had been close. But as the years went by and his life spiraled into chaos, she had distanced herself emotionally. She hadn't wanted to deal with the mess he had made of his life. "I don't know," Veronica said honestly. "I haven't seen him in a long time." Eli nodded, as if he understood more than any child should. "I miss him," he whispered. Veronica's heart ached for the boy. She stopped walking and knelt down to his level, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We'll find him," she promised. "I'm doing everything I can to bring him back." Eli stared at her with those wide, innocent eyes, and for the first time since he had arrived, Veronica felt a genuine connection between them. She hadn't wanted this responsibility, hadn't planned on taking care of her brother's child. But now that he was here, she couldn't imagine abandoning him. As they continued their walk, Veronica found herself reflecting on the choices she had made. She had spent so many years running away from her family, convinced that success and independence were the only things that mattered. But now, with Eli by her side, she was beginning to realize that maybe there were more important things than building an empire. By the time they returned to the house, Veronica felt a sense of clarity that had been missing for a long time. She would find Jason, no matter how difficult it was, and she would protect Eli, even if it meant facing her own fears and regrets. The days that followed felt like a race against time. Veronica's once orderly schedule had been completely upended as she tried to juggle her responsibilities at work with the mounting pressure of her personal crisis. She kept in close contact with James, who was working tirelessly to track down Jason. But every lead seemed to end in a dead end, and the frustration was beginning to wear on her. One afternoon, James called with an update that sent a chill down her spine. "I've been digging deeper into Jason's debts," he said. "It looks like he owes money to some very dangerous people. Loan sharks. There's even talk that some of them have ties to organized crime." Veronica's hand tightened around the phone. "What does that mean for us?" James hesitated before answering. "It means that Jason didn't just disappear because he couldn't handle the pressure. He's hiding. And if these people find out that you're involved, if they know you've taken an Eli, they might come after you too." Veronica felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She had feared this from the moment she learned about Jason's debts, but hearing James confirm it made it all too real. She wasn't just trying to find her brother anymore. She was trying to protect herself and Eli from forces much bigger than she had anticipated. "What do we do?" Veronica asked, her voice calm despite the panic bubbling beneath the surface. "I'm working on it," James said. "But in the meantime, I'd suggest laying low. Don't draw attention to yourself or Eli. And if you notice anything suspicious, anything at all, you call me right away." Veronica nodded, though she knew he couldn't see her. "All right. Thanks, James." After hanging up, Veronica stood in the middle of her living room, staring at the pristine walls and expensive furniture that suddenly felt like a prison. She had spent her entire life building a fortress of wealth and success, and yet here she was, trapped by circumstances beyond her control. Eli appeared in the doorway, his small face curious. "Who was that?" Veronica forced a smile. "Just a friend, helping with some work stuff." She didn't want to burden him with the danger that was looming over them. He had already been through enough. But Eli wasn't easily fooled. His wide eyes searched her face, and Veronica could see the fear lurking behind his quiet demeanor. He knew something was wrong, even if she didn't tell him. "Is it about my dad?" Eli asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Veronica hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, we're still looking for him." Eli's expression didn't change, but Veronica could see the weight of her words settle over him. He turned and walked away, leaving Veronica alone with her thoughts. She knew that she couldn't keep him in the dark forever, but for now, she needed to focus on keeping him safe. As the days wore on, Veronica found herself grappling with a growing sense of isolation. She had always been a private person, carefully controlling the image she presented to the world. But now, with the threat of danger hanging over her, that privacy felt like a curse. She had no one to turn to, no one who truly understood the complexities of her situation. Her colleagues at work had noticed her increasing absence and erratic behavior. Veronica had always been the epitome of control, sharp, decisive, and unyielding. But now, she felt herself slipping, the weight of her personal life pulling her away from the professional image she had worked so hard to maintain. One morning, after a particularly restless night, Veronica sat in her office, staring blankly at the documents spread out before her. She was supposed to be preparing for a major presentation, but her mind kept drifting back to Eli, to Jason, to the looming threat that was slowly closing in on her. Her assistant knocked on the door, poking her head in. "Ms. Gray, the board meeting is in an hour." Veronica looked up, blinking as if she had forgotten where she was. "Right, I'll be ready." But as the door closed behind her assistant, Veronica knew that she wasn't ready. She wasn't ready for any of this. The walls of her life were closing in, and for the first time in years, she felt powerless to stop it. Later that afternoon, Veronica sat in the conference room, surrounded by her colleagues and the board members. Normally, she would have thrived in this environment, confident in her ability to command the room. But today, she felt disconnected, as though she were watching herself from a distance. As the meeting progressed, Veronica found it harder and harder to focus. Her thoughts kept drifting to Eli, to the threats James had warned her about. What if something happened to him while she was here, sitting in this sterile boardroom, pretending that everything was fine? She glanced down at her phone, half expecting to see a message from James or a call from the police. But there was nothing, just the ticking of the clock and the drone of voices around her. Suddenly, One of the board members addressed her directly, pulling her out of her thoughts. "Ms. Gray, what's your take on the current projections?" Veronica blinked, her mind scrambling to catch up. She hesitated. The words stuck in her throat. "I'll need to review the numbers again. Let's table this discussion for now." The room fell silent, and Veronica could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her. She had never been one to falter in a meeting, never one to back down from a question. But now, her uncertainty hung in the air like a tangible presence. After the meeting, her assistant approached her, concern etched across her face. "Is everything all right, Miss Gray? You haven't been yourself lately." Veronica forced a smile, though it felt hollow. "I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind." The assistant nodded, but Veronica could see the doubt in her eyes. She knew that people were starting to notice the cracks in her armor, and it terrified her. She had built her entire life on the foundation of control, of being the one in charge. But now, with the walls closing in, that control was slipping through her fingers. When Veronica returned home that evening, she found Eli sitting in the living room, quietly drawing. He looked up when she entered, his face lighting up with a small smile. "Did you have a good day?" he asked, his voice innocent and full of trust. Veronica felt a lump form in her throat. How could she explain to him that her world was crumbling, that she was barely holding on? Instead, she smiled back and nodded. "It was fine. How about you?" Eli shrugged, his attention returning to his drawing. "It was okay. I just stayed here." As Veronica watched him, she felt a surge of protectiveness wash over her. No matter what was happening in her life, she had to keep Eli safe. That was the only thing that mattered now. The rain had returned, drumming steadily against the large windows of the living room as Veronica and Eli sat in silence. Veronica watched as Eli continued his drawing, his small hands carefully outlining a figure. It wasn't until she looked closer that she realized he was drawing a house, a small, worn-down house that looked nothing like her grand mansion. Veronica shifted uncomfortably in her seat, wondering what memories this drawing was pulling from. Eli had been more talkative lately, asking questions about her life, her work, and even her childhood. He was opening up little by little, and while part of her was relieved to see him come out of his shell, another part of her was unprepared for the emotional weight it carried. "Is that your old house?" she asked softly, leaning over to get a better look. Eli nodded, his eyes focused on the drawing. "It's where we used to live, before we had to leave." Veronica felt a familiar pang of guilt. She had distanced herself from that part of her life for so long, but now it was staring back at her in Eli's sketch, a reminder of the family she had left behind, the brother she had abandoned to navigate the chaos alone. "What happened?" she asked, even though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Eli shrugged, his expression somber. "Dad said we couldn't stay anymore. He said it wasn't safe." Veronica's stomach tightened. Safe. That word had taken on a whole new meaning since James' warning about Jason's involvement with dangerous people. She wondered if Jason had known all along that they were in over their heads and had been trying to shield Eli from it, even as he failed to protect him in other ways. "Do you remember where it was?" Veronica asked, trying to piece together more of Jason's movements. Eli paused for a moment, then shook his head. "We move a lot. I don't remember the names of the places." Veronica's heart sank. She was no closer to finding out where Jason might have gone. And the more Eli revealed about their nomadic life, the more Veronica realized how fragile and unstable his world had been. It was a miracle he had held on as long as he had. "Why did you leave your house?" Eli asked suddenly, his wide eyes meeting hers. Veronica wasn't prepared for the question. She had spent years justifying her decision to cut ties with her family, telling herself it was for the best, that she needed to escape to build a life for herself. But how could she explain that to a 6-year-old who had just lost everything? "I needed to start over," she said carefully, choosing her words. "I wanted to build a life where I could take care of myself." Eli stared at her, his expression unreadable. "Did it work?" Veronica hesitated, feeling the weight of the question settle over her. Did it work? She had everything she thought she wanted: success, wealth, independence. But at what cost? I thought it did, she said finally, her voice quiet. But now I'm not so sure. Eli nodded, as though he understood, and went back to his drawing. Veronica watched him for a moment longer, feeling a strange mixture of guilt and responsibility. She had abandoned her family to build a life on her own, and now that same family had come back to her, not as the past she left behind, but as a fragile, innocent boy who was slowly becoming a part of her world. That evening, as Veronica prepared dinner, her phone buzzed with a message. She glanced at it, expecting it to be from James with an update on the search for Jason. But when she unlocked the screen, her heart sank. The message was from an unknown number. It read, "We know where you are. Your brother isn't the only one who owes us." Veronica's breath caught in her throat, her hand trembling as she set the phone down on the counter. She read the message again, hoping it was some kind of mistake, but the words stared back at her, cold and threatening. Her mind raced. They had found her. The people Jason owed money to, dangerous people, according to James, had found her. And now they were coming for her and Eli. She quickly dialed James' number, her pulse pounding in her ears. He picked up after the first ring. "Veronica, what's going on?" "I just got a message," she said, her voice tight with fear. "They know where I am, James. They're threatening me." James cursed under his breath. "Listen, Veronica, you need to stay calm. Don't do anything rash. We don't know if this is just a scare tactic or something more. How did they even find me?" Veronica asked, pacing across the kitchen. "I've been careful. I haven't told anyone. They have ways," James replied grimly. "They might have been tracking Jason, and now that you're involved, they see you as part of the equation. You're wealthy, and they know it." Veronica clenched her fists. Her success, the very thing she had fought so hard for, had now made her a target. And worse, it had put Eli in danger. "What do I do?" she asked, trying to keep the panic from rising in her throat. "You need to lay low," James said. "Don't leave the house unless it's absolutely necessary. I'll come by later tonight, and we'll figure out the next steps." Veronica nodded, even though the idea of doing nothing made her skin crawl. She wasn't used to being powerless, to having her life dictated by forces she couldn't control. But now, with Eli depending on her, she didn't have a choice. After hanging up, Veronica glanced over at Eli, who was still sitting in the living room, engrossed in his drawing. He had no idea what was happening, no idea that their lives were now hanging in the balance. As the evening wore on, the weight of the situation pressed down on Veronica, suffocating her. She had spent her entire life running from her past, convinced that if she worked hard enough, built a life of wealth and control, she could escape the chaos that had defined her childhood. But now, that very chaos had followed her into the fortress she had built, threatening to tear it all down. That night, as she lay in bed, unable to sleep, Veronica made a silent vow. She would protect Eli, no matter what it took. She wouldn't let him suffer for the mistakes of the adults around him. She had failed Jason, but she wouldn't fail his son. The tension in the house was palpable as Veronica waited for James to arrive. Every sound seemed amplified. The ticking of the clock, the distant hum of traffic outside, the occasional creak of the floorboards. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, waiting for her to make a move. Eli had gone to bed earlier, exhausted from the day's events, and Veronica was grateful for the quiet. But was a restless quiet, filled with the weight of the threat that now hung over them. When the doorbell rang, Veronica jumped, her heart pounding in her chest. She hurried to the door, glancing through the peephole before opening it. James stood on the other side, his expression grim. "Thanks for coming," she said, stepping aside to let him in. James walked into the foyer, taking in the opulence of her home with a quick glance. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. Veronica nodded, leading him into the living room. She already poured herself a glass of wine, but now, with James here, she suddenly felt too nervous to drink it. "They know where I am, James," she said, cutting straight to the point. "How did they find me?" James sat down, his brow furrowed. "That's what I've been trying to figure out. These people, whoever they are, they have resources. It's possible they were tracking Jason's movements for a while, and when they realized you were connected to him, they followed the trail to you. Veronica clenched her fists, her anger rising. I've been careful. I've kept my personal life separate from my business. How could this happen? James hesitated, and Veronica could see the conflict in his eyes. There's something else, Veronica. Something I didn't tell you before. She narrowed her eyes, her stomach sinking. What are you talking about? James shifted in his seat, looking uncomfortable. I've been digging into Jason's debts, trying to figure out who's behind all this. And I found something troubling. One of your business partners, a man named Alan Richards, has ties to the people Jason owes money to. Veronica froze, her mind racing. Alan Richards. He had been one of her closest allies in the business world, someone she had trusted implicitly. He had helped her navigate complex deals, had been by her side during critical moments in her career. And now, to hear that he was involved in this mess, it was almost too much to process. What do you mean, ties? She asked, her voice hardening. Richards has been funneling money through various shell companies, many of which are linked to the same loan sharks Jason got involved with. It looks like he was using Jason to cover some of his own tracks. Veronica's pulse quickened, her anger boiling over. So, you're telling me that one of my business partners, someone I trusted, has been working with the people who are threatening me and Eli? James nodded. I know it's a lot to take in, but we need to be careful. If Richards is involved in this, it means the danger is closer than we thought. You need to be cautious about who you trust. Veronica stood up, unable to sit still any longer. She paced across the room, her thoughts swirling. Betrayal. The word echoed in her mind like a bitter taste she couldn't get rid of. Richards had been like a mentor to her, someone she had relied on during the most critical moments of her career. And now he was at the center of the web that threatened to destroy everything she had built. What do I do now? She asked, her voice quieter than before. James stood, his expression serious. You need to keep your distance from Richards. Don't let on that you know anything. I'll keep digging, but for now, you need to focus on keeping yourself and Eli safe. Veronica nodded, though her mind was still spinning. Richards. The man she had trusted. The man who had been by her side through it all. And now, he was part of the reason her world was falling apart. As James left the house that night, Veronica sat alone in the darkness, the betrayal weighing heavy on her chest. She had always prided herself on being able to see through people's lies, on being able to trust her instincts. But now, everything she thought she knew was crumbling. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and uncertainty. Veronica kept a close eye on Eli, watching for any signs that something was amiss. She avoided Richards, keeping her interactions with him strictly professional, though it took every ounce of willpower not to confront him directly. But despite her best efforts, the danger that had been looming finally struck in the most unexpected way. It was late one evening when Veronica realized something was wrong. She had stepped out to make a quick trip to the store, leaving Eli with the housekeeper for just an hour. When she returned, the house was eerily quiet, too quiet. Eli, she called out, walking through the hallway. There was no response. Panic surged in her chest as she rushed through the house, checking every room. But Eli was nowhere to be found. The housekeeper, who had been in the kitchen preparing dinner, looked equally alarmed. He was just here, the housekeeper said, her voice shaking. I only turned my back for a moment. Veronica's mind raced, her heart pounding in her ears. She grabbed her phone, dialing James' number with trembling hands. James, Eli's gone, she said, her voice barely controlled. He's been taken. James' response was immediate. Stay where you are. I'm coming over. Veronica hung up and paced the living room, her mind filled with worst-case scenarios. Who had taken him? Was it the loan sharks or someone else entirely? The message she had received flashed through her mind. Your brother isn't the only one who owes us. Her phone buzzed again, and this time, the message was clear. We have the boy. If you want him back, you'll pay what your brother owes us. No police, or the boy disappears. Veronica's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about Jason anymore. It was about her. Her success, her wealth, had made her a target. And now Eli, was paying the price. James arrived within minutes, his face set in grim determination. "We need to act fast," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "But we can't let them know we're onto them." Veronica nodded, though inside she felt like she was unraveling. The fear of losing Eli was overwhelming, suffocating. She had promised herself that she would protect him no matter what, and now it felt like she was failing. "We'll find him," James said firmly, "but you need to keep your head clear. These people are dangerous, but they're not invincible. We just need to be smart about this." Veronica swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus. She couldn't afford to fall apart now. Eli's life was in danger, and she needed to stay strong. Together, they began formulating a plan. James would try to track down the kidnappers, using his contacts to gather as much information as possible. In the meantime, Veronica would prepare to meet their demands, though she had no intention of simply handing over the money without a fight. As the hours passed, the weight of the situation pressed down on her like a physical force. Every second that ticked by felt like a countdown, a reminder that time was running out. But beneath the fear, a new resolve began to take hold. Veronica had spent years building her life, her fortune, her independence. She had fought her way out of the chaos of her past, and now, that same fight was rising within her again. She wouldn't let them win. She wouldn't let them take Eli. Not without a fight. The hours dragged by as Veronica and James worked tirelessly to gather information. Veronica had always been a woman of action, someone who thrived in high-pressure situations, but this was different. This was personal. Every minute that passed without word from Eli felt like a lifetime, and the fear gnawed at her relentlessly. James had managed to pull a few strings, leveraging his connections to track down possible locations where the kidnappers might be holding Eli. The message had been clear: pay up, or the boy disappears. But Veronica had no intention of giving in without a fight. This wasn't just about the money. It was about the power these people thought they held over her. After what felt like an eternity, James received a lead. A warehouse on the outskirts of a city, known for being a front for various criminal operations, had seen unusual activity in the past few hours. It wasn't much, but it was the best lead they had. Veronica didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat and keys, her mind already focused on what needed to be done. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" James asked as they drove toward the warehouse. "These people aren't playing games." Veronica clenched her jaw, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "I don't care. I'm getting Eli back." The drive was tense, the city streets giving way to darker, more desolate roads as they neared the industrial area. The warehouse loomed ahead, its hulking structure silhouetted against the night sky. Veronica could feel her pulse quicken, but she pushed the fear aside, focusing on the task at hand. They parked a safe distance away, James advising caution as they approached the building. Veronica followed him, her heart racing. The sound of her footsteps seemed too loud in the stillness of the night. As they reached the side entrance, James motioned for her to stay back. "Let me go in first. I'll see what we're dealing with." Veronica nodded, though every fiber of her being screamed at her to rush inside and tear the place apart until she found Eli. But she knew James was right. They couldn't afford to be reckless. James slipped inside, leaving Veronica waiting in the shadows. The seconds stretched on, each one heavier than the last. She couldn't stand awaiting, the not knowing. Every noise, every creak of the building made her flinch. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, James reappeared. His face was grim, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "He's here," James said quietly, "but they've got him locked up in the back. We'll have to be quick." Veronica's heart leapt into her throat. Eli was here. He was alive, but the danger was far from over. They moved silently through the warehouse, weaving between stacks of crates and dimly lit corridors. Veronica's mind raced, imagining the worst-case scenarios, but she forced herself to stay focused. She couldn't afford to lose control now. Finally, they reached the back of the building. James pointed to a small room at the far end of the corridor, where two men stood guard outside the door. Veronica could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. She wasn't used to being in these kinds of situations, dangerous, violent confrontations, but the thought of Eli being so close fueled her determination. James handed her a small object, a stun gun. "Just in case," he whispered. Veronica nodded, her hands shaking slightly as she took the device. She had never used anything like this before, but tonight, she was willing to do whatever it took. James moved first, slipping behind one of the guards and knocking him out before he had a chance to react. Veronica's breath caught as she watched, her nerves on edge. The second guard turned, startled, but James was too fast. Within moments, both men were unconscious, and the door to the room was unguarded. Veronica rushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest as she pushed open the door. Inside, she found Eli, sitting in the corner, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees. His eyes widened as she entered, and for a brief moment, relief washed over her. "Eli." Veronica ran to him, pulling him into her arms. Eli clung to her, his small body trembling. "I was so scared," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Veronica held him tightly, her heart breaking at the sound of his fear. "It's okay," she said, her voice shaking. "You're safe now." But as much as she wanted to savor the moment, she knew they weren't out of danger yet. They needed to get out of the warehouse before anyone else showed up. "Let's go," James said, his voice urgent. "We don't have much time." Veronica stood, lifting Eli into her arms. He was light, too light, and she felt a surge of anger at the thought of what he had been through. But there was no time for anger now. They needed to move. As they made their way back through the warehouse, Veronica kept her eyes on the exit, every step feeling like it took an eternity. But finally, they reached the door and stepped out into the cool night air. Veronica let out a shaky breath, the weight of the past few hours crashing down on her. Eli was safe. They had made it. In the days that followed, Veronica found herself struggling to adjust to the aftermath of the rescue. Eli was safe, but the trauma of what he had been through lingered in both of them. He had become even more attached to her, following her around the house as though afraid she might disappear if he let her out of his sight. Veronica, too, found it hard to let go. The fear of nearly losing him had shaken her to her core, and now, every time she looked at him, she was reminded of how fragile life could be. But amidst the fear and the anxiety, something else had shifted in Veronica. She had spent so many years focused on her career, on building a life for herself that was free from the chaos of her past. But now, with Eli in her care, she realized that her priorities were changing. She had spent so much time running from her family, from the pain of her childhood, but now she was beginning to see that she couldn't outrun it forever. Family was a part of her, no matter how much she had tried to distance herself from it. One morning, as Veronica sat at the kitchen table with Eli, watching him eat his breakfast, she made a decision. It was time to stop running. "We're going to find your dad," she said quietly, her eyes meeting Eli's. Eli looked up, his expression uncertain. "Do you think we can?" Veronica nodded, her resolve firm. "Yes, we will. It wouldn't be easy." Jason was still out there, still entangled in whatever mess he had gotten himself into. But Veronica wasn't going to abandon him this time. She had learned that running away from her family wasn't the solution. The only way forward was to face the past head-on, to confront the pain and the mistakes and find a way to heal. As the days turned into weeks, Veronica found herself rebuilding, not just her life, but her relationship with Eli. She had always prided herself on being strong, on being independent. But now, she realized that true strength came from the connections you built with others, from the people you chose to let into your life. Eli had become a part of her world, a part of her heart, and there was no turning back. She would protect him, just as she had promised. But more than that, she would be there for him, in a way that she hadn't been for Jason. Together, they would face whatever came next. And for the first time in years, Veronica felt like she wasn't alone. Here's a request you can use at the end of your video. Hey everyone, If you enjoyed The Child Outside Her Mansion, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It really helps us grow and create more content for you. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What moment in the story had the biggest impact on you? Was it the emotional bond between Veronica and Eli, or perhaps the tension during the rescue? Let me know in the comments below. And, of course, I'm always open to new ideas. What kinds of stories would you like to see next? Whether it's more thrilling mysteries, emotional dramas, or something completely different, your suggestions are always welcome. Thanks for watching, and I can't wait to see what stories we'll create together.